مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يعتقد أن جنرالاتنا همكا ولكنه يعينوهم في أعلى المناسب، ويعتقد أننا نشارك في عدد أكبر من اللازم من الهروب خارج البلاد، ولكنه يرغب في توسيع نطاق معركتنا العسكرية ضد الدولة الإسلامية، ويرغب في الدخول في شراكة مع روسيا، ولكنه يريد الوقوف في وجه أهم حليف إقليمي لروسيا وهي إيران. مرحبا بكم في عالم تناقضات وتقلبات سياسة الأمن القومي في ظل ولاية ترامب. بطبيعة الحال يسمح للمرشحين بقول أشياء مختلفة للجماعات المختلفة للفوز بالأصوات، إلا أن الحكم أكثر صعوبة ويتطلب انضباط أكبر. وعلى مدار الأشهر المقبلة سنرى كيف تترجم وعود المرشح ترامب إلى سياسة الرئيس ترامب. لمناقشة شخوص وسياسات نهج إدارة ترامب خلال الدفاع والأمن القومي، يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أكثر صحفيي واشنطن المعنيين بتغطية أخبار البنتاغون سيادة إطلاع واحتراما، وهو جيمي ماكنتاير. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. So we begin a new administration, another administration at war. And today our guest is someone who knows the inside of America's Pentagon and our national security establishment better than just about anyone. Journalist Jamie McIntyre. Jamie, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So the United States has been at war for now 15 years, nonstop. Must be lots of implications for that in the building you know so well, the Pentagon. What do you think?
Well, President Obama is ending his term. He had hoped to end both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He thought he ended the war in Iraq and had drawn down in Afghanistan, but the rise of Daesh or ISIL required the U.S. to send troops back into Iraq and also special operations forces into Syria. And the resurgence of the Taliban has also required the United States to maintain a much higher presence there. So as President Obama leaves office and President-elect Trump takes office, America's longest running war in Afghanistan is still going on, and there is still significant fighting in Iraq and in Syria to battle the rise of the Islamic State.
So how does our military, both leadership and the average soldier, sailor, airman, how do you keep up a tempo of warfare that is now 15 years? I mean, you were at the Pentagon even before 9/11, so you know what it's like in peacetime. How do you keep this up for so long?
Well, one thing, of course, is the United States has significantly changed the way it conducts both of these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Initially, when the invasion of Iraq took place in 2003, there was a very large U.S. military and coalition presence. The U.S. was taking the lead. American soldiers were doing a lot of the fighting. In Afghanistan, in 2001, when the United States first went in there after the September 11th attacks, they initially leveraged some of the local forces, the local fighters in Afghanistan, but quickly began drawn into sending many more American troops there. And again, mostly the U.S. and some of the NATO allies in Afghanistan were doing the most significant fighting. Now we flash forward to today, and in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, American troops are not on the front lines. They are in dangerous duty. Many of them are special operations forces whose role is to advise, to assist, to help train, to help arm the forces, but they're not at the very front lines. And that means that the United States has been able to conduct these wars with significantly fewer U.S. troops. In Iraq, it's about 5,000 Americans. In Syria, about 500. We're down to around 10,000 troops in Afghanistan. And it's taken a long time, but the United States has been able to build up the capability of the local forces. In Afghanistan, for instance, the big challenge there was for ground troops to be effective, they need to have air cover. They need to have an air force that is capable of providing cover for the troops on the ground. And Afghanistan had no air force. But this year, for the first time, they've been able to actually field some airplanes and helicopters, and they've been able to conduct some of their missions independently. That means that for the first time, Afghanistan has been able to actually plan and execute some of the missions entirely on their own without the help of the United States. And in Iraq, we saw the same thing. You know, when the Islamic State overran Syria and then into Iraq in 2014, the Iraqi army was sort of falling apart. It was riven with divisions. There was a lot of unhappiness about the government in Baghdad. The Shia-dominated government was alienating some of the Sunni folks there. So the army just sort of collapsed in the wake of the Islamic State assault. So it's been a very slow process, but they've been built back up, and they've been having considerable success over the past year, liberating one Iraqi city after another. And as we're talking now, the battle is still going on for Mosul, and in Syria, local fighters, Kurdish and Syrian Arab forces, are marching to try to isolate Raqqa, the Islamic State's other self-declared capital in Syria.
One of the experiences from the past was the departure of American forces, especially from Iraq, but also the drawdown in Afghanistan, gave the enemy an opportunity to regroup and redevelop and reassert itself. Is there a sense that even at these low levels, American forces may have to stay deployed in these countries for the foreseeable future?
Well, they may, but in much smaller numbers. One of the lessons that the United States learned was that it doesn't matter if the United States, with its overwhelming military power, can liberate a city. After that, the city has to be governed and held, and there has to be local support. And that means that can only be done with troops who are and forces that are from that area. An outside occupying force can't hold on to territory forever unless the United States wants to commit to an unending occupation. So that's one of the lessons that they've learned. The United States could go in with its overwhelming combat power and defeat the Islamic State in much shorter time than what's taking now. But then they would be stuck trying to turn it over to someone, and who would they turn it over to? So the reason it's taken so long is because it's not just developing the local forces to fight the Islamic State, but then it's to make sure that they have what at the Pentagon they call a hold force that's made up of local people. So for instance, take the situation in Raqqa. The forces that and it's more difficult for the United States in Syria because unlike Iraq, they don't have a government, a functioning government that they can cooperate with. In Syria, there's a civil war going on side by side with the effort to defeat the Islamic State. So it's taken much longer time to develop a loose coalition of forces that includes Syrian Arabs and Syrian Kurds, and they're going to go down and isolate Raqqa. They're going to essentially encircle it and then develop a plan to go in. And the U.S. is insistent that the forces that go in and liberate Raqqa and the ones who stay there and protect it after it's been liberated have to be forces that are from that area, not outside forces. And one of the delicate diplomatic situations they're dealing with is that Turkey, which feels that it has a stake in some of these areas, wants to be directly involved in this liberation of Raqqa, and the United States is not certain that that's the best idea. So right now, the U.S. is negotiating with Turkey about what role it might play in the eventual liberation of Raqqa. We can't tell how long these operations are going to last, but it does seem at this point that the outcome is inevitable. It does appear that both Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria will be liberated sometime in the coming year.
Now, let's take this conversation and put it in the context of our election campaign. Candidate Trump was violently critical of the military strategy that President Obama was waging in Iraq and Syria. He said our generals were stupid and that they were poor, our military was poorly prepared, et cetera, et cetera. Now, things are said on the campaign and governing is different. Is there any impact or legacy of these comments in the military, in the Pentagon?
The comments of President-elect Trump have raised some big questions about how the strategy might change in the Trump administration. President-elect Trump has said that he wants to accelerate the campaign. He wants to defeat the Islamic State soundly, but he said some contradictory things on the campaign trail, so we're kind of waiting to see what happens. At the Pentagon, military planners, well, first of all, I would just point out that they're constantly looking for ways to accelerate the pace of operations against the Islamic State. It's not like they're satisfied with what's happening now. And a lot of that involves working with allies and getting them to contribute more, and trainers, and putting together these hold forces, as I mentioned. So they're already doing what Trump is talking about when he said he was going to ask his generals for a plan to defeat the Islamic State even faster. If there's a criticism of President Obama's strategy, and people look back with the benefit of hindsight and say, where did he make a mistake? Everybody points to the so-called red line, when President Obama said that if Syrian President Assad used chemical weapons, that would be something that that would force the United States to act. Instead, President Assad managed to work out a deal where he would supposedly get rid of his chemical weapons with the cooperation of Russia, and that also invited Russia to come in. If at that point the United States had, say, instituted a no-fly zone or told Assad he couldn't fly his planes before the Russians had come in, there might have been a chance to protect enclaves in Syria, stem this flow of refugees, and save really what's hundreds of thousands of lives of people.
Much more difficult to do it now.
It's almost impossible, because now you have the Russians there in great numbers, and technically they have the legal high ground in the sense that they're there at the invitation of the Syrian government, and the United States is not. So instituting some sort of no-fly zone now would be a very difficult proposition.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk more about changes in defense policy, including defense personnel, such as the Secretary of Defense, with our guest, Jamie McIntyre. Again, our guest today is Jamie McIntyre, a name and a face that millions of Americans associate with top-notch media coverage of the Pentagon and national defense issues. Jamie is currently senior writer for defense and national security for the Washington Examiner and an adjunct professor of multimedia journalism at the University of Maryland. In his long and distinguished career, he served for 18 years as CNN's Pentagon correspondent and is currently a news anchor for National Public Radio. He received a bachelor's degree in broadcasting from the University of Florida. In 2002, was honored as a distinguished alumnus, and he has his master's degree in journalism from the University of Maryland. All right, so Jamie, let's move to the interesting appointment that President-elect Trump has made for Secretary of Defense. Only the second time that a recently retired military officer, James Mattis, four-star general, will be named Secretary of Defense. Why is this significant? How will this impact the other ranking officers of the civilian command in the Pentagon?
Well, so one of the bedrock principles of the American military, which sometimes distinguishes it from other countries, is the idea of civilian control of the military. As the famous Clemenceau once said, war is too important to be left to the generals. And so it's a very important principle in the United States. In fact, it's enshrined in law that the defense secretary is supposed to come from civilian life. And if you take a retired general or admiral and make them defense secretary, they're supposed to be out of uniform for at least 7 years. General Mattis, who is a legendary Marine general, only retired in 2013, so he doesn't meet that 7 years. But he is got such a reputation, he's so well respected, that it appears that he'll be able to easily get a waiver and be confirmed. As you said, only the second time a retired general has headed the Defense Department. That, by the way, doesn't apply to other positions in the government, only the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. And Mattis is respected because he's not just a general, he's also a scholar of history. You know, President-elect Trump doesn't have any record of military service, and despite his claim that he knows more about the Islamic State than the generals, he doesn't know nearly what, say, General Mattis knows. So part of the thinking, I think, is that they believe that Mattis, a scholar warrior, deeply steeped in history, who knows all the players in the Middle East, can tell you the history of the conflicts around the world, former U.S. Central Commander, former NATO commander, will be a very good addition to Trump's cabinet, in the sense that he'll be able to provide some really informed advice about military operations. And as a general who's fought in war, he knows the cost of war and how it often is not as simple as people think. Now, Mattis has a reputation of being a little more hard line, particularly against the concerned about the threat posed by Iran. But he's not an ideologue. He's not dogmatic. He's pragmatic, and he's somewhat flexible in his thinking. He's the kind of general who, when he gets new information, is open to changing his mind. And I think that's one of the things that has impressed people about James Mattis. You know, one thing I might just tell your viewers is they may have heard that Mattis's nickname was Mad Dog. And they might be wondering, do we want somebody who's a mad dog in charge of the U.S. military? Well, I would just say that, one, that's not a nickname he came up with. Although now that President Trump uses it all the time, he may be stuck with it. And really, it really referred to his devotion to duty and his singular focus on the task. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that just because he has a nickname of Mad Dog that he's crazy in any way. He's probably one of the least crazy people in Washington.
In addition to General Mattis, President-elect Trump is naming other generals to senior positions. A former Southern Command commander to run Homeland Security, a former Defense Intelligence Agency commander to run the National Security Council. Is this viewed as the ascension of the generals, and is this, in your view, a good thing or a bad thing or indifferent?
Well, it depends a lot on the individual, just like in the case with General Mattis. In the case of General Kelly, who was the former U.S. Southern Commander, he's being put in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, protecting the United States. As the Southern Commander, that was part of his portfolio. He's very well versed in border security. He worked hand in glove with the current Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson. And so he knows the job very well. He's very suited to that, and again, has a deep knowledge. You have to remember, when you talk about all these generals in the cabinet, that it's not that unusual for a few generals to make it in. People forget that when President Obama formed his first cabinet in 2009, when he first took office, he had 3 generals in his cabinet. He had his national security advisor, General Jim Jones. He had Dennis Blair, who was the head of the intelligence, the director of national intelligence, one of the first. And also he had a retired General Eric Shinseki, the Army chief, to be head of the Veterans Department, the Department of Veterans Affairs. And again, each one was uniquely qualified. I mean, I don't think anybody would be concerned that you had a general who'd served in the military for a long time trying to look after the welfare of veterans who had served. That doesn't seem out of place. Same thing with having somebody in intelligence who's worked with intelligence their entire career. You know, for instance, David Petraeus, the celebrated general during the Obama administration, was at the CIA because of his expertise. So when it's not the case that we're facing some sort of military takeover by generals. It's just that in the case of the new president, he's trying to appoint people whose expertise particularly matches the job that they're being given. And in the cases that you've talked about, that's the case. Now, the most controversial appointment is of Lieutenant General Michael Flynn as the National Security Advisor, because Flynn is a little more confrontational and a little more suspicious of the Muslim world. And that's raised some concerns on Capitol Hill. But his job, unlike the other two, where he's advising the president, does not require confirmation from the American Senate, from the U.S. Senate. So he'll be able to serve even though some people on Capitol Hill say they don't think his temperament is suited for the job.
Jerry McIntyre, thank you so much for your insights on President Trump and the military, the Pentagon, and where we're headed. Appreciate you having us.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
هذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول سياسة الرئيس ترامب حيال خلفائنا التقليديين في أوروبا والشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.